non-treated, and this was Sharpen, Roundup, methylated seed oil, and AMS, and you can see it did a great job of cleaning that up. Now, the other herbicide that we talked about in this family that's new for this year is Verdict. Again, this is Outlook plus Sharpen, this premix. In soybeans, our use rate is 5 ounces per acre. That gives us an ounce of Sharpen. Again, remember, we're not going to see a lot of residual from that Sharpen, and it's only going to give us 4 ounces of Outlook. So if we're using Outlook in soybeans, typically we'd use it at 18 ounces per acre. So at 4 ounces, you're probably not going to get much benefit. Again, probably where you would use this would be as a burn down herbicide. Again, take mixed with glyphosate. And probably where I would see you would potentially use this in soybeans is if you were using Verdict in your corn, and instead of buying Sharpen by itself, you had leftover Verdict and you were just going to use it in that burn down. The restrictions are going to be similar to Sharpen, and then rotation restriction will also be the same. There's not a long rotation restriction, but now it'll be 4 months to small grains because of the Outlook in there. As far as the weed control, Post-Emergence again, horseweed, it's going to be excellent. Good on our mustard species like field pennycress. And again, tank mixtures with glyphosate are needed to control some of our tougher weeds like purple dead nettle, henbit, and common chickweed. So those are some of the changes to the soybean section and some of the new herbicides. Does anybody have any questions on any of those? Okay. We've done some wheat research over the last few years looking at some different weed control options with some of the newer herbicides and some of the existing herbicides. And I'm going to talk about that in a few minutes, but I thought I'd just kind of do a quick survey by a show of hands on what herbicide you guys are actually using in your wheat. How many people are using 2,4-amine in their wheat? Anybody? Okay. What about 2,4-ester? A few people? Okay. How about affinity broadspec? Okay. Husky? Quite a few people using Husky. How about mixtures of some of these products? So let's say like a 2,4-D affinity broadspec. Anybody doing any mixtures? Okay. All right, so that kind of gives us a little bit of a handle on what people are using. Anybody not spraying their wheat for weeds? I mean, that's, highly, a lot of times you may not see any differences in yield. So just trying to get a handle on this. So with the 2,4-D products, historically it was thought that 2,4-D ester actually might cause yield loss in wheat compared to 2,4-D amine. So in the past, in our weed guide, it said use 1 pint of 2,4-D amine and 3/4 of a pint of 2,4-D ester. Now, there's been a lot of people that use a higher rate of 2,4-D ester, and we just wanted to see if really that was warranted, that needed to be a lower rate. Is that really true that there are differences between these formulations? So that was one thing we wanted to look at. The second thing we wanted to look at is in some cases, when we're putting those herbicides on, we might be using 28% UAN as a spray carrier to help get some additional nitrogen on. So in some of those cases, we see some burn on the wheat, and we're wondering what happens as far as yield. And in some cases, some guys might use 50% water and 50% 28% nitrogen with these tank mixes to see what happens. So over the last 3 years, we've done some research to see, okay, what's the crop safety? Are there any differences in weed control? And then more importantly, what are the yields of these different herbicide treatments, particularly if we're using 28% as the carrier. So that's some stuff that we've been doing that's been funded by the Michigan Crop Improvement Association. We've done some different timings, but I'm really going to focus on a timing when you would actually be looking at putting on your herbicides in wheat, and that's usually just prior to jointing between feed stages 4 and 5. The different treatments we had was basically an untreated, so no herbicide, 2,4-D amine at a pint, 2,4-D ester at a pint, affinity broadspec at 3/4 of an ounce plus non-ionic surfactant. That surfactant is needed for the weed control. Husky, 11 ounces plus surfactant plus additional nitrogen. In this case, we use 2 quarts of 28% UAN. Now the other thing we wanted to look at is the spray carrier. So we applied all these treatments with just 100% water. We applied them all with a 50-50 mixture of 28% and water, and then 100% 28% UAN. And to make sure that our nitrogen was equivalent on all the plots, so nitrogen wasn't a factor, within a couple days we would put the remainder of the nitrogen on. So for example, a couple days later we would actually put 56 pounds of nitrogen on to make sure that nitrogen didn't cause any differences in yield. Now here are some of the weeds that we looked at. This is common chickweed, henbit, field pennycress, and mayweed chamomile. So those were some of the weeds that were at our locations. And looking at weed control, we didn't see any differences between the spray carriers, but we did see differences in herbicides. This blue bar is mayweed chamomile, green bar pennycress, chickweed, and henbit. So it'd be 2,4-D and amine and ester. No differences between the two. And what we would expect, usually chickweed is not controlled very well with the 2,4-D products, or henbit's not either. Now looking at affinity broadspec, we had excellent control of all the weeds, and then husky, we also had good to excellent control of all 4 of those weed species. And again, the spray carrier really didn't affect it. So we didn't see where, if we applied it with 28%, that we saw a reduction in weed control. So it was not affected by that. Where we did see some differences was based on weed injury. So this is just some of the injury ratings we took 7 days after treatment. 2,4-D amine, no injury. 2,4-D ester with the water, the 50-50 spray carrier, and then this would be 100%, 28% nitrogen, just a little bit of burn, not much there. So really insignificant. Affinity broadspec, this would be with spray carrier of water, the 50-50 mixture, and then 100%, 28% UAN. Remember that the affinity broadspec would also have a surfactant in there. So we saw as much as about 23% injury. So there was quite a bit of burn when we applied it with 100% of nitrogen as a carrier. So it'd be husky, no injury from the water, a little bit, about 7%, really not a lot with a 50-50 mixture, but with 100%, very similar to what we saw with affinity broadspec. And again, that 100% was where we saw the most injury with the affinity broadspec and husky. So here are some pictures of that. So it'd be affinity broadspec and surfactant with the water, the 50-50 mixture, and 100%, 28% as the carrier. You see a little bit more burn, may not be very easy to see here. And then husky, basically the same thing, and saw quite a bit of burn. So the important thing is, how does this actually affect yield? So this is our yield results combined over 3 years. And so if we look at this and we were able to combine it across our nitrogen rates, basically what we saw is our lowest yield was from our untreated. So there was a benefit to having a herbicide, and there were no statistical differences at, we would say, where we're 95% confident. Now, if we kind of broaden that a little bit, where we say we're 90% confident, we actually saw a slight reduction in yield with those ones where we saw the most injury. So maybe under certain conditions, we might see a slight reduction in yield. Again, this is looking at a much lower significance level, so we're not as confident that there would be treatment differences, but it's potential that it could happen. So from this, we've kind of changed some of our recommendations. One of them is to say, okay, well, 2,4-D ester at a pint is safe. It's also safe to apply 2,4-D ester, 2,4-D amine with 28% without any issues as far as reductions in yield. Again, there's no surfactant there. Now, where we thought we saw more of a problem was with the husky and affinity broadspec, particularly where we had 100%, 28% UAN as our spray carrier. And probably surfactant was the main reason for that. So because that surfactant was in there, it was getting that nitrogen in there, causing more burn. It may affect yield under certain conditions. And it seemed like if we went with a 50-50 water, 28% UAN, there were no reductions in yield or injury, in yield. Winter annual weed control was not affected by the nitrogen carrier. And then basically for broad spectrum control, we actually saw better control of all the weeds with affinity broadspec and husky. So That's kind of what we saw from our wheat study. I don't know, does anybody have any questions on that? Be happy to answer any questions on weed control and wheat? Or, yes?
Did you mix any fungicides like headland or headlight and all that?
Nope, not in this study. We haven't mixed any fungicides in there. So I know at certain points, you know, there's a lot of the fungicide applications going on. Some of those fungicide applications might be going on later than what our weed control application is. But yeah, in this particular study, we haven't looked at that. Yes.
Did you do any testing on changing the source of, not necessarily mixing the herbicide with the nitrogen, but just changing the sources of nitrogen? In other words, urea versus liquid versus...
Yeah, that's a good question. Did we do any work looking at changing the sources of nitrogen as far as the nitrogen applied to the wheat? We haven't looked at that, but some of our soil fertility guys have looked at some of the different sources of nitrogen. I think Daryl's done some of that work, and Martin, have you done some of that also?
In combination with herbicide, you mean?
No, I think, no, just from a nitrogen standpoint.
Say, put the herbicide on with just water, but change the nitrogen sources for the nitrogen portion of the application.
And that won't affect injury, of course, but there's some efficiencies relative to nitrogen materials, that there's differences there and different responses.
Yeah, and our soil fertility guy's done some of that work, and I don't have the results. I don't know if you have the results for that.
We can touch on that later, but what Daryl was finding, and we saw it too, you know, we saw some efficiencies with ESN plus urea, but also both of us got some response to ammonium sulfate. So some of the things we're doing, if you're committed to a granular, and that's a really good point, you know, in terms of programs, we'd still rather have the 28% separate from the herbicide. There's material suggesting you don't mix them, but Jim had these results similar too. It's not that injurious. Nevertheless, the guy's willing to go with granular, or is able to go with granular and apply it very well. Urea is a pretty good base, but maybe adding 30-40% ESN as a source, it's a nice hedge. But ammonium sulfate offers a little bit different activity as well. And so every time we use that, or most times we use that, we get a little bit of better efficiency, more response to wheat if we blend that urea with either your ESN and or ammonium sulfate. Now those, compared to 28, very comparable. I still get a little advantage with the ESN in the urea, but 28%, where we'd like to go with wheat, is almost all 28%, or a good fraction of it through streamer nozzles. Because if we have time, I'll show you some numbers. As we up our nitrogen rates on wheat, where that nitrogen is applied is probably more important than what source you use. We're going to go up to 110, 120. I think we can handle that, except where we overlap. And we're overlapping all the time. And basically with granular fertilizers, you don't know where they're landing, especially with spinner spreaders. It's never uniform enough.
Christy, then in summary, what you showed there is it really doesn't make any difference which product you use there as far as crop safety, correct?
Correct. Yeah. So I would say, you know, I would probably recommend against using Affinity Broadspec or Husky if you're going to apply it with, you know, 100%, 28%. But other than that, as far as crop safety, especially with the 2,4-D products, there wasn't any difference.